and welcome to another episode of the Tombstone Tourist. This week I'm back at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. Hollywood is one of Virginia's largest and most historic cemeteries. But just a side note, the crime rate in Richmond is pretty high. This area that the cemetery is located in is not the safest area in the city. So if you're driving in, it's probably a good idea to be aware of your surroundings, especially when you're waiting at a stoplight. Now, with that being said, Hollywood is a large 130-acre cemetery that sits on a hill overlooking the James River. This cemetery is the final resting place of two United States presidents, James Monroe and John Tyler, as well as the only Confederate president, Jefferson Davis. More than 18,000 Confederate veterans are buried here, including 28 Confederate Generals, more than any other cemetery in this country. Two of the more notable generals that are resting here are General Jeb Stuart, who we will visit in a future episode, and the man that is best remembered for that ill-advised charge at Gettysburg. Here, in the far corner of the cemetery just beyond the Confederate Pyramid, where more than 3,000 veterans from the Gettysburg campaign are buried, we find the man known for Pickett's charge. George Edward Pickett was born here in Richmond, Virginia on January 16, 1825. He was the first of 8 children born to Robert and Mary Pickett and grew up on the family plantation on Turkey Island. As a teen, he went off to Springfield, Illinois to live with his uncle named Andrew Johnson, no relation to the future president. His uncle was a prominent lawyer in Springfield, and young George spent some time serving as a law clerk in his uncle's office. While in Springfield, George also studied law and met another young Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln. At the age of 17, George received an appointment to the United States Military Academy. He was appointed to West Point by Congressman John Stuart, who was a friend of George's uncle and one of Abraham Lincoln's law partners. At West Point, George was not a particularly good student. He was mischievous, and no one was immune from his pranks. He studied very little and did only enough to ensure that he would graduate. He did graduate. In 1846, George Edward Pickett graduated last in his class of 59 cadets. The following year, his cousin, future General Henry Heath, graduated last in the class of 1847. Ordinarily, such a poor showing would ensure that the two young second lieutenants would not enjoy a long military career. But just as George graduated, the Mexican-American War broke out and the country was in need of junior officers. And off to war George went. George distinguished himself in battle when his friend Lieutenant James Longstreet was wounded in battle while carrying the colors of the company. Longstreet handed the colors off to Pickett, who carried the flag over the wall and fought through the enemy line. He eventually unfurled the flag from the rooftop, signaling victory to his comrades. In January of 1851, George married the first of his 3 wives. Sally Harrison Minge was the great-great-grandniece of President William Henry Harrison and the great-great-granddaughter of Benjamin Harrison V, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Their marriage was short-lived as Sally died in childbirth just 11 months later, in November 1851. Distraught and grief-stricken, George struggled for several years before accepting an assignment to oversee the construction of Fort Bellingham in what is today Washington State. While stationed at Fort Bellingham, George built a home and married his second wife, a Native American named Morning Mist. Together, the couple had a son named James Tilton Pickett. But once again, George's happiness was short-lived as Morning Mist died just a few months after giving birth to James. James grew up to be a noted newspaper artist in the Pacific Northwest. He died of tuberculosis in 1889 at the age of 32. The house that George built still stands and is today the oldest structure in Bellingham, Washington. George again struggled with the loss of his second wife and considered resigning his commission, but he remained in Washington until the start of the Civil War. After the firing on Fort Sumter, George's native state of Virginia seceded from the Union. George, ever loyal to his home state, did, in fact, resign his commission from the Union Army and traveled to Richmond, Virginia, to accept a commission in the Army of Northern Virginia. George was a colorful officer who wore a perfectly tailored uniform with a double row of gold buttons. He rode a stunning deep black horse named Old Black. His first combat command was during the Peninsula Campaign, where he proved to be an able commander under fire. He suffered a shoulder wound at Gaines' Mill that kept him out of action for 3 months. When he returned to action, George was promoted to Major General and served in the same division as his old friend, James Longstreet. Longstreet, along with Pickett and John Bell Hood, were detached from Lee's main army and missed the Battle of Chancellorsville. They instead found themselves in the Tidewater area of Virginia, participating in the Suffolk campaign. It was during this period that George met and fell in love with Sally Corbell. On November 13th, 1863, 20-year-old Sally married 38-year-old George. The couple had 2 children, George Edward Pickett and David Corbell Pickett. In June of 1863, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was amassing near the Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. From July 1 through July 3, 1863, the 2 massive armies met in the fields around Gettysburg. George arrived in Gettysburg on the second day of the battle. The next day, on July 3, 1863, the 2 armies faced off across a large field. General James Longstreet was in command of the 3 divisions of Confederate troops that was poised for the attack on the Union forces that was across the open field on a small ridge. The division commanders were Generals Isaac Trimble, James Pettigrew, and George Pickett. After a 2-hour artillery barrage, the 3 Confederate divisions raced across the open field. This is forever known as Pickett's Charge. Pickett's Charge was an epic failure and a bloodbath for the South. While the Union Army suffered 1,500 casualties, the Confederates suffered over 6,000. More than half of the Confederate soldiers that charged across the open field were either killed or wounded. Pickett's division consisted of 5,500 men. 224 of them were killed, 1,140 were wounded, and 1,500 was listed as missing in action or captured. 3 of Pickett's brigade commanders and all 13 of his regimental commanders were either killed or wounded. Now, I told you that General James Longstreet was technically in command of the Confederate assault. The attack became known as Pickett's Charge, largely thanks to the embellishment of the newspaper reporters. Since General Pickett was the only Virginia general to participate in the attack, the Virginia newspapers exaggerated Pickett's role. It was his home state's newspapers' misguided attempts to make George Pickett a hero that forever branded him as an epic failure. After the failure at Gettysburg, Pickett commanded the Southern troops in North Carolina. He was ordered to capture the city of New Bern, North Carolina. The ensuing battle resulted in another Confederate defeat. Following the battle, Pickett ordered the execution of 22 captured Union soldiers. He claimed he was simply executing deserters. This would be another stain that would follow Pickett for the rest of his life. Pickett remained active for the rest of the war. Then on April 9, 1865, George Pickett commanded his remaining troops in the final battle at Appomattox Courthouse. He surrendered, along with General Robert E. Lee, and was paroled on April 12, 1865. After the surrender at Appomattox, the federal government launched an investigation into the Newbern event where the 22 Union soldiers were executed. Pickett, fearing prosecution for the executions, fled to Canada, where he remained until General Ulysses S. Grant recommended that the investigation end and assured Pickett that he would not face any charges. Pickett returned to the United States in 1866 and worked as an insurance agent and farmer in Norfolk, Virginia. On June 23, 1874, the United States Congress officially granted General George Pickett a full pardon. A year later, on July 30, 1875, he passed away from the complications of a liver abscess. He was 50 years old. He was initially buried in Norfolk's Cedar Grove Cemetery, but a few months after his death, his remains were disinterred and he was reburied here in Hollywood Cemetery. Sally Pickett would live for another 55 years following her husband's death. Like George Custer's wife Libby, Sally spent those years defending her husband and trying to rehabilitate his reputation. Sally died at the age of 87 on March the 22nd, 1931. Hollywood Cemetery declined to permit Sally to be buried next to her husband. Instead, she was cremated and buried at the Abbey Mausoleum in Arlington, Virginia. The Abbey went bankrupt in 1968 and the mausoleum fell victim to vandals and fell into a sad state of disrepair. Sally's remains stayed at the abandoned mausoleum until 1988, when the United Daughters of the Confederacy raised the funds and arranged for her ashes to be moved here to Hollywood Cemetery, where today she is finally resting next to her husband, General George Pickett. Well, this video is getting a little long, so I'm going to end it here at the graves of George and Sally Pickett at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. In the coming weeks, I'm going to be visiting some of the other notable people who are buried here. People like General Jeb Stuart, Presidents James Monroe and John Tyler, and the Pathfinder to Sea, Matthew Fontaine Maury. If this is your first time here, I hope you'll consider subscribing. And if you're already a subscriber, I want to thank you for your support and for helping my channel grow. And if you're so inclined, a thumbs up is always appreciated. Now, until next week, please remember, life is a wonderful journey. Be sure to take time and enjoy it. And I'll see you down the road. So long, everybody.